Imagine arriving in the most powerful kingdom on earth with nothing but chains around your wrists. No family, no wealth, no title, no army, no influence. In ancient Egypt, a civilization that had already stood for centuries before most nations even existed, your fate would already be decided. Society was built like a pyramid. At its peak stood Pharaoh, believed to rule by divine authority. Beneath him came powerful priests, military commanders, royal officials, and wealthy landowners. At the very bottom were laborers, servants, and slaves whose names would never be remembered by history. A foreign slave had no place in this world. He wasn't expected to rise. He certainly wasn't expected to stand beside Pharaoh himself. And yet one man did exactly that. His name was Joseph. For thousands of years, his story has been told as one of faith and divine providence. But behind the familiar biblical narrative lies a much larger mystery. How could a Hebrew outsider earn the complete trust of the most powerful ruler in the ancient world? What kind of political system would even allow such a rise? And is there historical evidence that places Joseph within the real Egypt known through archaeology and inscriptions? This isn't simply a story of dreams interpreted or famine avoided. It's a story of power, survival, and one of the most astonishing social transformations ever described in the ancient world. To understand how a slave became Egypt's most powerful man, we first have to understand the empire that should have made such a rise impossible. Egypt did not become the greatest civilization of its age by accident. Long before Rome was founded, and centuries before Greece reached its golden age, Egypt had already mastered engineering, administration, agriculture, and state organization on a scale the world had never seen. The Nile flooded with remarkable regularity, leaving behind fertile soil that sustained millions and drew merchants, diplomats, and invaders alike, all hungry for a share of its abundance. At the center of it all stood Pharaoh, far more than a king. Egyptians believed he was chosen by the gods to preserve Mat, the sacred balance that held the universe together. Every successful harvest and military victory reinforced the idea that his authority was woven into creation itself. Challenging him wasn't merely politics, it was a threat to cosmic order. Supporting him was a sophisticated bureaucracy. Scribes recorded taxes with astonishing precision. Officials managed irrigation that turned desert into farmland. Priests controlled vast temple estates. Every level of society understood its place, and advancement, when it came, was slow, bound almost always by birth, family, and years of loyal service. Foreigners occupied an even more uncertain position. Egypt traded widely and welcomed skilled outsiders. Yet they remained outsiders. Different languages, different gods, often viewed with suspicion. In peace, they could prosper. In crisis, they were the first questioned. The idea that a foreign slave could one day command Egypt's officials and act with Pharaoh's own authority would have seemed almost unimaginable. That is what makes Joseph's story so extraordinary. But before we can appreciate how high he climbed, we have to understand just how deep he fell, because his path to power began with a betrayal devastating enough to erase everything he had ever known. Joseph's downfall did not begin in Egypt. It began at home. He was his father's favorite son, a position that bred quiet resentment among his brothers. The special robe he wore was more than a gift. It was a public sign that he was loved differently, perhaps destined for something above them. Then came the dreams, sheaves of grain bowing before his own, and later the sun, moon, and 11 stars paying him homage. In the ancient Near East, dreams were not dismissed as idle thoughts, they were treated as messages. Whether Joseph meant to boast or simply shared what he believed, his brothers no longer saw an arrogant younger sibling. They saw someone claiming authority over them, and resentment slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. One day, as Joseph approached them in the field where they tended the family's flocks, they saw him coming and had already decided. Some argued he should be killed outright. Instead, they stripped him of his robe, threw him into an empty cistern, and sold him to a passing caravan for 20 pieces of silver. His robe, dipped in blood, convinced their father that a wild animal had killed him. Jacob mourned the son he believed dead, while Joseph was carried farther and farther from everything he had ever known. Most people who vanished into ancient slavery disappeared without a trace. Joseph should have become one of them. Instead, his arrival in Egypt marked the beginning of a journey no one could have imagined. The moment Joseph crossed into Egypt, his old life ceased to exist. To the traders who sold him, he was simply cargo, a healthy young man with value in the slave markets of the richest civilization on earth. Slavery in Egypt was not uniform. Some slaves endured brutal labor in fields and workshops. Others, depending entirely on their owner, were trained, educated, and trusted with real responsibility. Joseph's new master, Potiphar, was described as an important official serving Pharaoh, meaning Joseph entered not an anonymous field, but a household connected to the highest levels of Egyptian government. Every day placed him among scribes documenting inventories, officials arriving with reports from distant provinces, and merchants delivering goods from foreign lands, the administrative machinery that let Egypt govern a vast, prosperous empire. Joseph watched all of it, and he learned. He quickly earned Potiphar's trust and was placed in charge of the entire estate, a role demanding accounting, logistics, leadership, and the oversight of dozens, perhaps hundreds of workers. Long before he ever advised Pharaoh, Joseph may have been mastering the practical foundations of administration inside one of the kingdom's most influential homes. Then everything collapsed a second time. Potiphar's wife tried repeatedly to seduce him. When Joseph refused, loyal to his master, and he believed to God, rejection turned to revenge. She accused him of assault. In a household where her word carried the weight of the elite, Joseph had no real defense. Within moments, the trusted servant became a convicted prisoner. Egyptian prisons were not simple holding cells for criminals. They also housed officials who had fallen from royal favor, and 2 such men appear in Joseph's story: Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker. The cupbearer held one of the most trusted posts in the kingdom, protecting Pharaoh from poison. The baker served the royal household as well. Their presence suggests Joseph wasn't lost in an ordinary jail, but held in a prison tied to the royal administration itself, meaning he remained remarkably close to the center of power, even in chains. Once again, leadership found him. He earned the warden's confidence and was placed in charge of the other inmates. Then, on the same night, the cupbearer and the baker each had a troubling dream. Joseph interpreted both. The cupbearer would be restored to his post, the baker executed. Days later, both predictions came true exactly as described. Before the cupbearer returned to the palace, Joseph asked one simple favor: "Remember me before Pharaoh." He didn't. The cupbearer walked back into his old life and forgot Joseph completely. 2 years passed in silence. Every sunrise looked like the one before it. If the story ended there, history would never have remembered Joseph's name. But beyond the prison walls, the most powerful man in Egypt had just begun losing sleep. Pharaoh dreamed he stood beside the Nile as 7 healthy cows emerged from the river, followed by 7 thin, sickly cows that devoured them without growing stronger. He woke disturbed, slept again, and dreamed of 7 full ears of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. To modern ears, these images sound strange. To an ancient Egyptian whose entire civilization depended on the Nile's rhythm, they were terrifying, a possible warning from the gods themselves. Pharaoh summoned every priest, scribe, and dream interpreter in the kingdom. Egypt had an entire tradition devoted to reading dreams. Archaeologists have even found manuals listing their symbols and meanings. And yet, faced with the ruler's visions, none of Egypt's wisest men could explain them. At that exact moment, the cupbearer suddenly remembered the young Hebrew prisoner who had read his own dream with perfect accuracy 2 years before. Everything Joseph had endured, the betrayal, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, even being forgotten, had led, without his knowing it, to this single, precise moment when Egypt needed an answer no one else could give. Guards entered his cell. They shaved him, dressed him in clean garments, and brought him before the most powerful ruler on earth. Joseph entered a court filled with men who had spent lifetimes climbing. Egypt's hierarchy, priests, scribes, officials from noble families. In the middle of them stood a foreign prisoner with no title and no reason to expect mercy. Pharaoh explained the dreams. Joseph's answer revealed something unexpected. He claimed no personal wisdom. The interpretation, he said, would come from God. Then he explained that both dreams described a single future from 2 angles: 7 years of extraordinary abundance, followed by 7 years of famine so severe people would scarcely remember the good years before it. Then Joseph did something no one had asked of him. He proposed a solution. During the years of plenty, Egypt should collect a portion of every harvest, build granaries throughout the kingdom, and appoint officials to oversee collection, preservation, and distribution, so that when famine came, Egypt would already have what it needed to survive. This was more than a spiritual insight. It was statecraft, logistics, taxation, and long-term planning on a national scale. Pharaoh recognized instantly what his entire court had missed. Joseph hadn't merely explained the future. He had handed him a blueprint to save an empire. Pharaoh removed his own signet ring and placed it on Joseph's hand, dressed him in fine linen, hung a gold chain round his neck, and set him in the 2nd royal chariot, with orders that all Egypt bow before him. In a matter of hours, a prisoner had become the 2nd most powerful man in the kingdom. Receiving Pharaoh's authority was only the beginning. Predicting the crisis was one thing, surviving it was another. Egypt stretched for hundreds of miles along the Nile, and Joseph understood that saving it would take one of the most sophisticated logistical operations the ancient world had ever attempted. The first years confirmed his prediction. Harvests grew so abundant the fields seemed endless. It would have been easy to celebrate and assume the good years would last forever. Joseph refused to let success create complacency. Under Pharaoh's authority, officials traveled the kingdom collecting a portion of every harvest, building and expanding granaries near major population centers, and recording incoming supplies with remarkable precision. It meant coordinating farmers, laborers, transport workers, and governors across an entire kingdom, protecting grain from insects, rot, and theft, years before any of it would be needed. According to the account, the harvests eventually grew so vast that officials stopped even trying to measure them. Then the Nile changed. Crops failed, not just in Egypt but across the region. Fields that once overflowed produced almost nothing. In neighboring lands, food vanished, prices soared, and desperation spread, while Egypt alone opened granaries full from years of preparation. Caravans soon crossed deserts from every direction, seeking the one resource that had become more valuable than gold. The kingdom that once exported luxury goods was now exporting survival itself. And every foreign delegation that arrived acknowledged Pharaoh's authority in the process. As the famine deepened, Egyptians exchanged their silver for grain, then their livestock, then their land, and finally their own labor in service to Pharaoh. By the end of the crisis, the crown controlled more of Egypt's wealth than ever before. Joseph hadn't only prevented catastrophe, he had reshaped the Egyptian state itself. Hundreds of miles away in Canaan, another family began to feel the same hunger. Joseph's brothers heard there was grain in Egypt and set out toward it, with no idea that the man controlling that grain was the brother they believed they'd never see again. When Joseph's brothers arrived, they came as thousands of desperate travelers had before them, and they bowed, unknowingly, fulfilling the very dreams they had once mocked him for. Joseph recognized them instantly. Years, Egyptian dress, and an interpreter stood between them and any memory of the boy they'd thrown in a pit. To them, he was simply an Egyptian official. He questioned them carefully, learned that his father Jacob was still alive, and that his younger brother Benjamin had survived, and revealed nothing. Instead, he accused them of being spies, held Simeon as hostage, and sent the rest home with grain, demanding they return with Benjamin as proof of their story. On the road home, guilt caught up with them. "We are guilty concerning our brother," they admitted to one another, remembering how he had begged for mercy from the bottom of the pit while they ignored him. Joseph overheard every word before they left, and, unable to contain himself, turned away and wept. His power had changed his circumstances. It had not erased his humanity. When the brothers returned with Benjamin, Joseph struggled to stay composed, twice leaving the room to weep alone before resuming his disguise. At a feast, the brothers were seated in exact birth order, unsettling them immediately, and Benjamin was given a portion 5 times, larger than everyone else's. Years earlier, favoritism had fueled the brothers' jealousy toward Joseph. This time, faced with the same situation, nothing happened. No resentment, no bitterness. One final test remained. Joseph had his silver cup secretly hidden in Benjamin's sack, then sent guards to discover the theft after the brothers departed. Years earlier, the brothers had abandoned one favored brother to save themselves. Now, facing an almost identical choice, they chose differently. Judah stepped forward, described their father's grief, and offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place rather than abandon him. The transformation was complete. Joseph no longer saw the men who had thrown him into a pit decades earlier. He saw men reshaped by guilt and loyalty, and the revenge he had every reason to pursue suddenly lost its meaning. Joseph ordered every Egyptian servant out of the room. For the first time in decades, he stood alone with the brothers who had changed the course of his life. Then he wept so loudly, according to the account, that the sound echoed through the palace and everyone outside could hear it. Years of restraint collapsed in an instant. Finally, he spoke the words none of them could have imagined. "I am Joseph." The room froze. These were men who had believed their brother dead or lost forever, and now discovered he was alive and held their fate entirely in his hands. Instead of revenge, Joseph offered them a larger truth. He didn't deny what they had done. He acknowledged it fully, but he also saw it through a wider lens. What they had intended for harm, he believed, had become the means through which countless lives were saved. Without the betrayal, there was no house of Potiphar. Without that, no prison. Without prison, no meeting with the cupbearer. Without that meeting, no standing before Pharaoh at the exact moment Egypt needed him most. Every tragedy had become a step toward a destination none of them could have imagined. He embraced Benjamin, then each of his brothers in turn. A family shattered by jealousy, finally reunited not because the past was forgotten, but because forgiveness proved stronger than revenge. Pharaoh himself welcomed the news, inviting Jacob and the entire family to settle on Egypt's most fertile land, protected from the famine still gripping the world outside. Did any of this leave a trace in the historical record? No inscription or monument names Joseph directly, but that silence isn't necessarily damning. Egyptian records were built to celebrate kings, conquests, and the favor of the gods, not internal economic crises or the foreign officials who helped manage them. Many historians point toward the second intermediate period, when the Hyksos, foreign origin rulers such as Apophis, based in the delta city of Avaris, controlled parts of northern Egypt. It was a more decentralized Egypt than the rigid dynasties before it, with strong trade and migration ties to Canaan and a well-documented Semitic presence in administrative roles. In that kind of political climate, a foreign official rising into high economic authority becomes far more historically plausible than it would under a fully centralized native dynasty. Egypt's granaries, taxation systems, and administrative precision are already well attested in the archaeological record from long. Before this era, what changes in unstable periods is not whether these systems exist, but who controls them. There's no definitive proof linking Joseph to Apophis or any specific pharaoh, but the alignment between the biblical account and what we know of this turbulent, foreign-influenced period remains one of the most discussed possibilities among scholars trying to place Joseph somewhere on Egypt's timeline. The names of many pharaohs have faded from memory. Their temples have crumbled. Their monuments lie buried beneath the desert. Yet the story of a young Hebrew sold for silver, imprisoned in a foreign land, and elevated to stand beside the most powerful ruler on earth, is still told across cultures, languages, and generations. History rarely remembers those who begin at the top. It remembers those who rise when every reason to succeed has been taken from them. And that is what makes Joseph's journey one of the most extraordinary stories ever connected to ancient Egypt.